Started. All right, I just started the recording. So everybody, welcome to the Soaring Society of Boulder Ground School. We don't really have any announcements to go into right now, other than we're very pleased to have Bob Caldwell, one of our top soaring pilots, give a presentation on cross-country soaring. And, you know, in terms of cross-country soaring, what's more important at Boulder than doing that? Whoops, what's happening here? Is somebody sharing a screen, or we got a problem?
I think Dan, you might have started sharing your screen.
Yeah, okay. Please nobody share the screen except for Bob Caldwell. I did turn it on so that everybody could share screen. So at any rate, there's really not much in the way of introduction here, except for please allow me to introduce Bob Caldwell. Bob started flying, got his private pilot's license at the tender young age of 17. Upgraded to a commercial pilot's license with an instrument rating at 20. Flew hang gliders for about 30 years and accumulated 1,500 hours, including a master rating in hang glider. Transitioned to sailplanes in 2003 and has logged some 2,000 hours in sailplanes. 100,000 kilometers of cross country. He has a gold badge with all 3 diamonds. He's won 3 regionals in the 18-meter class. Received, this is big, he received an FAA Master Pilot Award for 50 years of safe aviation. So he's been at it for a while. He's currently flying his own self-launching ASH 31 motor glider. And with that, I will turn this over to Bob. Bob, please take it away.
Thank you, Armand, and thank you as well for organizing these seminars. I think they've all been very valuable. I've seen them all, and I look forward to seeing some more after this one. I prepared a PowerPoint, and so I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen if I can figure out how to do it. Did anything happen?
Yes. Okay, start.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it. Perfect.
There you go.
All right. So anyway, I'm going to be talking about cross-country soaring. And basically this lead-in slide is a photo that I shot out of Nephi, looking out over the eastern desert on a classic Western soaring day. I'm probably 100 miles from home now at the time I shot this photo. And so what we're seeing here is, I think, some of the intrigue and excitement of cross-country soaring, to be out away from your home airport, approaching cloud base, but of course not getting there, and just having a grand old time extracting energy from the sky. So one of the slides I wanted to open with is a slide looking down the Sangre de Cristo mountain range, looking south here, and it kind of inspired me to just kind of open up the question, like, how far do you think you can go here under this cloud street over the Sangre de Cristos? And I think you can probably fly to Santa Fe, maybe even Moriarty. The cloud street seems to go forever. There's one thing wrong with this slide that we'll talk about a little bit later, and that is I'm too high. You can't really see what's going on ahead of you when you're at cloud base. So basically, the first question I was going to ask is, what is cross-country soaring? And it's basically just soaring, but you're going somewhere. And the idea is that there's a good possibility that you won't be landing back at your home airport. And the thing that I think anybody that's a cross-country soaring pilot can relate to is that once you see your glide back home disappear and go negative, it's kind of a liberating feeling because you are all of a sudden responsible to keep your glider in the air and to reach a safe point to land, hopefully back at your home airport. And one of the guidelines that I wanted everybody to think about leaving glide from your home airport is that if you can soar within the glide of the airport, and if you look ahead and the conditions look similar, you can soar there too. So you shouldn't be afraid to cut that cord and go ahead and go. And I just wanted to do a brief introduction beyond what Armand already did. I'm not a flight instructor, and so when I'm talking about these things, I'm giving you suggestions based on my experience, and nothing of what I have to say tonight is original thought. All of what I have to say is information that I have picked up from my mentors, from reading, from going to other seminars, and I'm very pleased that a number of my mentors are on this presentation. John Seaborn's been instrumental in my ability to become a better soaring pilot, as has Colin Berry, Bob Ferris, and a number of other of our members at our home club, as well as other pilots that I've gotten to know around the country. I wanted to welcome my friend Dan Ryan, who's watching from Seal Beach, California. I fly with Dan every year at Parowan with the motor glider guys. So anyway, it's also nice to see some of the Black Forest folks on here, and hopefully I can share some of the wisdom that I have gained by learning from my mentors and learning from other sources as we go through the presentation. I just wanted to also open with the idea that cross-country soaring, once you get past the basics of flying your glider, I think Yogi Berra said it best, and that's 90% of the game is half mental. And that's really what this is all about. Once you're a competent glider pilot, flying cross-country is really a head game. And it's very important that you understand that, because that's what's going to get you home. And again, another Yogi quote is that it's not over till it's over. And this is one of the main things that I wanted to make sure we talk about, and that is don't give up. It's always tempting to turn around and go back home while you still can, but cross-country soaring is not about going back home, not until you're ready anyway. And one of the quotes that I would make here is that you already know the stuff we're going to talk about, but hopefully we're going to talk about how to apply some of these things. So what we're going to talk about is some of the basic psychology of cross-country soaring, preparing yourself and your glider, reviewing a few principles of soaring, and we really want to create a list of rules of thumb. And we're going to talk about those in terms of climb as well as in cruise. And so these are items that you can kind of file away in the back of your mind, and you can add to these rules, because I'm sure I haven't been all inclusive, but you can add to these rules as you see fit and as you gain experience. And then at the end, we're going to have some time, I hope, for discussion and some questions. So what's holding you back from cross-country flying? Well, almost exclusively, it's the fear of landing out. And for those of you that saw Tom Zollner's presentation, he related his experiences in rock climbing and the need to control your mind. Panic is the enemy of good performance at almost anything you do. And one of the items that I think is that you have to be really in tune with is you've got to be willing and prepared to land out. And in order to be prepared to land out, not only does your equipment, your glider, your trailer need to be sound, but you also want to coordinate with other pilots so they can know how to grab your car, your trailer, and go out and get you, and make this as much of the less inconvenience a land out is, the more willing you're going to be willing to go. So one of the war stories I was going to talk about is Colin Berry's land out at when we were flying at Parowan, and Colin treated it as an adventure and only a minor inconvenience. And so I think that when you're prepared to do this, your fear of landing out will diminish. It's not going to go away, but it'll diminish. So once you're out of glide of home, it's all mental. And I wanted to make sure everybody understands that in cross-country soaring, there's really only one rule that you have to obey. And that is you always have to be able to reach a safe place to land. And that doesn't have to be an airport, but you always need to be able to reach a safe place to land. And this applies more than ever to anybody flying with an engine. I'm currently flying with an engine, and a number of the pilots probably on this presentation are flying with an engine, either a self-launcher or a sustainer. And it's really critical that you not treat that engine as a safety device. It's only a bit of convenience, such that if you need to fire it up in order to make it back home and avoid that land out, you can do that. But you can never rely upon that engine to start and save your ass. You can never do that. And again, landing out is only an inconvenience. You've got to control your mind. The amount of attention that you spend thinking about an outlanding is directly proportional to your altitude and location. And when you're high, you've got lots of options. Your focus has to be on flying and not landing. And John Seaborn a few years ago made a great presentation on the psychology of landing out and how you should be focused on that. But I think if you just paid attention to it, that's commensurate with your altitude and location, you're going to be fine. So the preparation of being able to fly, and I just wanted to really reinforce this, and this is going to be especially for people flying club gliders, because you don't know who flew your glider last. You don't know necessarily if the instrumentation is still the same as it's always been, that you're familiar with, but you've got to make sure that all the maintenance is done. You're familiar with all your instruments and your flight computer. You want to have FLARM. I think it's really important, especially as you get further and further away from the airport. And it's really critical. I think some of you are aware that there was a mid-air in Northern California this last season. And both gliders had FLARM, but one of the pilots had let their firmware expire. FLARM firmware expires. And unless you have a current firmware loaded onto your FLARM, it's not going to work. And so these two pilots have a mid-air because one of their FLARM systems didn't work and they never saw each other, and bang, we have a mid-air collision and two pilots under canopy. Everybody was okay with at least, I think, just minor injuries. I really want to encourage anybody that's going to fly cross country to have a GPS tracker, and also consider ADS-B out. You need to know, since we're not all from Boulder here, I've got Boulder turn points and airspace, but have the local turn points and airspace for your home airport loaded. Make sure that's up to date. You got to have a map. You got to know where you're going, and the tasks that you're going to try and fly, whether it's a badge flight or simply trying to maximize OLC. And again, Andrew, a week or so ago, talked about the necessary idea that you can stay hydrated. You have to be able to pee, so you've got to have a good relief system. You want to have a land out kit, like Tom Zollner has the land out kit to end all land out kits, where he's carrying a tent and a sleeping bag. I felt my land out kit was a little puny in comparison, but you get the idea. You want to be able to survive for a while, not at your home airport. So carry a land out kit. Preparing your trailer, and this is something that I have to tell a quick war story here at Joe Brock's expense. Joe landed out at Nephi one time, and he was kind of out in the middle of nowhere. So basically, John Stewart, myself, I think Gary Campbell was along. We all pile into Joe's Forerunner and head out. And once we're way out in the middle of nowhere, John Stewart, who's driving, looks at the fuel gauge and it's empty. So anyway, Joe, fill your car up with gas, please. But make sure you got your act together there, and make sure your trailer's equipped with the basic stuff you're going to need. A lifting 2x4 in case you have to pick the glider up without the wings on, and you've got a 2x4 through the spar box, and you can pick it up. You want to have spare fencing wire, tools, a padlock. If you have to cut somebody's lock at their gate, don't cut their lock, cut the chain, reconnect it with your padlock. But anyway, have a phone list, know who your tow pilots are. If you land at an airport, you can call for an aero retrieve. Make sure your act's together and your trailer's in good shape and airworthy, or roadworthy, I should say, and make sure that your crew knows what you're doing. So communicate. And remember that your cell phone very well may not work. There's lots of places you can land out west out here where you're not going to have any cell phone service. So if you're going to land out, make that radio call while you still have enough altitude to reach other pilots, let them know what's going on. And anyway, communicate. So you as the PIC, we talked about weather already. See Bob Ferris's presentation, excellent presentation on weather and soaring weather particularly. Know the terrain, make sure your flying skills are up to date. Flight planning, Colin Berry did an excellent presentation earlier. It's recorded on the SSB website. Go back and look at it if you haven't seen it already. And execute your flight, and then go back and analyze it and be self-critical. And again, I've listed safety last, but safety is first and foremost and always has to be. One of the things that is, I think, most important is to know how your Vario works. So what questions can a Vario answer? Well, the basic Vario is going to just tell you how fast you're climbing or descending. And so it's really a rate of change of static pressure. Now, when all of us are flying with compensated Varios, meaning their total energy, and that really measures how fast we're gaining or losing energy. So that basically adds airspeed into the equation. And the whole premise of total energy is that modern gliders can trade airspeed for altitude and altitude for airspeed and do so efficiently. That's obviously not completely true because there's going to be losses in the system. But one of the things I just learned, and here again, always be learning, but one of the things I just learned about a total energy variometer is that they're very sensitive to horizontal gusts. And those of us that fly out of Boulder, we know that trying to get connected and get up off a tow, or when you shut down, the thermals are small and tight. And so you've got to be pretty quick to go ahead and start your circle to be able to climb. And how many times have we all experienced that, where you get the beep, 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 and you rack in a turn only to find out it was merely a gust and there's no thermal there? Well, one of the problems with a total energy variometer that I should have known because I'm kind of a tech geek, but I didn't. And that is the total energy variometer is very quick to respond to horizontal gusts because it's an immediate increase in airspeed. The gust hits your aircraft, your airspeed jumps a little, and your variometer responds. The variometer, the system of the variometer, due to delays in the instrument plus the inertia of your glider, is slower to respond in changes in climb rate. So that's very, very important to understand. And I think you can use that to filter out some of the gusts in your own mind. Is if you get a really quick response on your total energy vario without feeling a surge in the seat of your pants, it's probably a gust. If it's a real thermal, you're going to feel the surge before you feel that. And we're going to talk about that more later. But the next point is you add in a netto variometer, and this adds in the glider's polar. So this is how fast is the air mass rising or sinking. And this is one of the most critical things in cross-country soaring, is to be able to fly energy lines with positive netto, meaning your glider may not be climbing, but the air you're flying in is actually going up, maybe slowly, but it's going up. Something I don't use, but other pilots do, is relative netto. And here you're adding in the circling polar of your glider, because that's going to tell you how fast you're going to climb if you slow down to climb speed and begin circling. So again, the variometer just adds to these various functions as you move up the ladder from the basic vario, which is going to show stick thermals. It's not going to filter out pulling back on the stick or pushing forward on the stick. You need total energy compensation to do that. And a well-compensated vario is very important. And I think the idea that you can use your understanding of the total energy system to filter out some of the horizontal gusts is important. So I'm not going to go through this very long, but basically modern speed to fly theory was devised way back even before I was born. But it's mainly famous due to Dr. Paul MacCready, who devised the mathematical concepts behind it. And he basically devised the MacCready speed ring. And we still refer to our settings that we're going to put on as the MacCready setting. We'll talk more about that later. But the theory here on speed to fly, you've probably all seen this chart that's up there, but that is a reprint from Cross Country Soaring by Helmut Reichmann. And what it basically shows here is that if you fly slowly, you get to the next thermal higher, but you get there late. If you fly too fast, you're too low, and it's going to take you a long time to climb. If you fly at the exact right airspeed, you get to the next thermal quickly, and you can climb quickly and be ahead of everybody else, the person that flies too slowly and the person that flies too fast. And this is basically the graph. You've all seen that. I'm not going to dwell on it, but you can learn a lot by doing this. And one of the links that I've got at the end of this presentation is a link to some of the seminars that the SSA is put on, and you can access these on the SSA website. And John Cochran, who we'll talk about more in a minute, who's one of the smartest dudes you're ever going to meet. He's a physicist who goes on to get a doctorate in economics, and he's a brilliant guy. And so what he was able to do, and we'll again talk about that in a moment, but he was able to factor in probability theory with MacCready theory. So what do the top pilots do? Well, typically they don't fly between thermals as fast as maybe a MacCready setting might dictate you're going to fly. Obviously, when you're high, you can fly faster and be more choosy. When you're low, fly slower and take a climb when you can get it. And mostly people ignore the speed to fly indicator. And we'll talk about that a little more when we get into some of our rules of thumb. And basically, it's the idea that there's an ideal speed to fly for whatever air mass or whatever the air is doing. But if you are chasing that, you're almost always going to be late. You're going to slow down too late. You're going to speed up too late. You're going to be behind the air mass and behind your glider. And the other thing that's important to know is that you can make substantial course deviations when you're chasing good air. I'm going to talk about a flight that Clements and I made this last fall. And for those of you that haven't seen Clement's YouTube video that he just put up about our flight, you should go ahead and look at that because Clements makes a lot of great points there, and we'll talk about some of those a little bit later here. But there we're making fairly substantial course deviations to fly in good air to achieve our goal. So what we're going to look at here is, let me see if I can make this happen. A laser pointer. There we go. This is basically a curve of looking at the speed to fly, and it's looking at what your cross-country speed's going to be. And your ideal cross-country speed is going to be here, that you're going to be averaging 50 knot cross-country speed. And to do that, you're going to your glider says you're going to be flying at 85 knots. Well, what you can see is that if you fly a little too slow or a little slower than optimum, you're not getting hurt very bad, not very badly at all. And so what you can see here is that you can err a bit on the slow side and not hurt your cross-country speed. And the graph on the right there that's basically contest points. And I know a lot of people watching tonight aren't contest pilots. And so you're tempted to say, well, I'm not a contest pilot, so this doesn't matter. Well, that's wrong, because it does matter. A good contest pilot is the pilot that flies most efficiently, who's able to extract most efficiently the energy out of the atmosphere to optimize their course. And it's exactly what you're going to do flying cross country. And so even though you may never fly in any competition, what you can see again is that if you fly at the optimum airspeed, you're going to win the contest day at 1,000 points. But if you're 10 knots too slow, 5 knots too slow, what you can see is you're still getting over 95% of what the points of the day would be worth. And so again, you're not, if you err a little bit on the slow side, it's not going to hurt you very badly. And here we're getting into, again, John Cochran's presentation, where he wrote a highly theoretical paper, and I have a link to it at the end of the presentation. If you want to really geek out, not only is he dealing with McCready theory, but probability theory about when you're going to find your next thermal, how strong it might be, et cetera, et cetera. And so the problem that you face with classic McCready theory is you really don't know where that next thermal is, and you don't know how strong it is. And so the very simplest rule of thumb there that we're going to come up with is, when you're high, you can be choosy and you can fly faster. When you're low, do the opposite. So again, reading John Cochran's paper is definitely worth your while, even if you don't geek out on the theory. This is a graph and graphical and charted explanation of thermal and bank angle versus airspeed. And this was done by my friend Dan Ryan, who was on the presentation tonight. And what we're seeing here, if I can move my my little pointer in here, ideally, most newer pilots don't fly a steep enough bank angle. And so by doing that, and the steeper the bank angle, that's necessary for the higher the performance glider you're flying. If you're flying a 233, you can get away with flying these shallow bank angles at lower speeds than what's graphed here. But what you're going to find is that high performance gliders like our Club Discuses, our Club 505, you're going to want to be racking that glider up to about 45 degrees to stay in the sweet spot of thermals, especially mountain thermals in Colorado. And so this basically tells you how tightly you're turning. And the 45-degree angle of bank will result in roughly a 20-second circle. And it's going to be just below a diameter of about 500 feet. So again, flying steep bank angles and going ahead and racking it up steeper than you think. One of the main things that I also wanted to make out is that this is from a paper that there's a link to by an Australian soaring coach named James Cooper. And again, this is in the metric unit, so it may not jive with what you saw in the previous one, but this is a demonstration of how important it is to fly precisely. And so in the graphics here, he starts out with a thermaling here, and he's at 45 knots and a 45-degree angle of bank. He gets a little lazy, and he lets the airspeed build to 50 knots and the bank angle to fall out to 40 degrees. And what has he just done? Inadvertently, he's moved the center of his circle considerably. And so simply by being lazy and not flying precisely, he's moved his circle out of the sweet spot of the lift. And one of the things that I'm critical of my own flying on is I get lazy in the thermal. And I'm not constantly trying to optimize my circling position. I'm not as precise on airspeed and bank angle as I should be. And so you just have to be precise in your flying, or you are going to move your circle and you're not going to know where that thermal is. And so flying precisely is absolutely critically important. Some of you may have seen presentations by Eric Carden, and Eric has made some of these presentations on the Soaring Society of America, the SSA website. But I thought this particular graph was pretty telling. And what you're able to see here is in the blue line, this is what the air is doing as you fly into a thermal. You get the sink at the edge, climb rate builds to a peak, begins to fall off, you get sink on the other side, and you're out the thermal. Now, what do you sense? Well, the G's that you're going to experience in the seat of your pants are going to time with the building of the thermal. But your glider and your variometer are going to respond later, because what's happening is that the system, and it's not just a delay in your variometer, but it's a delay due to glider inertia as to how quickly it can respond to the changing, rising or sinking air. So it's not going to respond immediately. And so what you have to do is you have to compensate mentally for this, and to understand that by the time your vario is signaling you're at the peak of the lift, well, you're past it. And so this is important when centering the thermal, as well as using other inputs that you're going to receive, such as the seat of your pants. You feel the surge here in the G's, vertical G's that the glider's experiencing in the seat of your pants before your instrument is going to respond and before your glider is going to respond. And so you can use that as another bit of input. One of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit here too, as we start more talking about cruising, is flying energy lines. And this is a photo I got from Clemens, and he's flying, it looks like northbound near the Continental Divide out of Boulder. And what we can see here is a classic, strong indication of convergence. So what we see on the eastern side, we see ragged looking clouds. And on this side, there's not going to be much lift in that convergence line. Here on the west side, you've got the nice flat bottoms. And so you're able to fly in the good side of the convergence, because what you have is obviously two air masses meeting. One air mass is drier than the other, but also one air mass is stronger than the other. And so we've got west wind coming over the divide, meeting east wind coming up off the plains. And for some of you, it might seem a mystery as to why we get east winds on the Front Range of Colorado when the prevailing wind direction is westerly. Well, the primary thing that relates to us as soaring pilots is we have the east-facing slope of the Rockies that heats up first in the morning, and that generates the rising upslope air and wind from the east that is going to be rising up to meet the westerly flow, usually just west of the, just east of the Continental Divide. Now, I have to show you another slide of convergence that's not nearly as apparent. And for those of you that have watched Clement's video here that he's posted, and he has a YouTube channel as well as a website with his blog called Chess in the Air. So if those of you that aren't familiar with that, I highly recommend you go to that, because Clements is one of the most perceptive and analytical people I've ever met. And he's been able to become a first-class soaring pilot in the shortest period of time. I'm embarrassed, because he's achieved in probably 4 years of focusing on cross-country soaring and becoming a better soaring pilot. In 4 years, it's taken me nearly 20 years to do. And that's just in sailplanes. I'm not even counting my hang gliding experience. But this particular photo shot from my cockpit, and I'm looking down the Sangre de Cristos looking north. As you'll see from my flight computer here, I'm navigating to Salida. And I'm probably 40 miles out of Salida here. I'm in glide of Salida, so I've got a safe airport to land. Plus there's numerous airports or landing fields in the San Luis Valley off my left wing. But what you're seeing here is a convergence line that's not nearly as well marked, or it's well marked, but it's not nearly as distinctive. And what you see here is to the left side of the screen, we've got the ragged cloud base that's somewhat lower. And to the right side of the screen, we've got the well-defined clouds. And what happened on this flight that caught both Clements and I by surprise is, again, one of the things I'll talk about in the rules of thumb is you always have to know where it's the sun angle on the terrain you're flying near, what's the wind velocity and direction, and be prepared for things to change. Because Clements and I, for the whole flight, had been seeing northwesterly winds. And we get to the Sangre de Cristos coming from the north. This is after we've turned around and headed back to the north. But as we get to the Sangres headed south, suddenly, one of the instruments I have here is an air glide display S, or they commonly call them butterfly varios. I get really positive instantaneous winds from this device, the best I've ever seen any device produce. And what you're seeing here is we're getting winds from the right side. And basically, I'm flying at about a 325 degree heading. So I'm heading northwest here. And the wind suddenly, as we got to the Sangres, turned to the east, came from the east. And had we not perceived that, we would have been flying on the wrong side of this convergence. Because even though we might have understood that, well, these clouds are ragged over here, these clouds are solid, we might not have figured that out. And over here on the west side, Clements was experiencing 6 knots of sink, while I'm flying under the good clouds at 6 knots of lift. And so here we're talking about the things we're looking at: the cloud appearance, cloud base, where's the wind, weather data in the cockpit. Now, what you're seeing here on my LX9000, and I'm fortunate enough to have really high quality avionics in my glider. But what you're seeing here is sky sights, convergence, prediction. And what we're looking at, of course, is the darker colors are the stronger the convergence. And so here in the cockpit, I'm getting the forecast, the weather forecast, not what's really happening, but the forecast weather for convergence along the Sangre de Cristos. And another question, this is somewhat rhetorical question, but how fast do you fly when you're under a cloud situation like this, where there's good lift, it's a strong energy line? How fast do you fly? Well, my McCready setting at this point in time is 3.2, and it says I should be flying at 89 knots. You might not see that very well here, but it's right there, is the speed to fly. And that's not based on what the air is doing at any given time. That's my static speed to fly. And so the question to ask is, what's the speed to fly in an energy line like this? And I think there's a right way to do it, and I probably do it wrong. But I kind of like the idea of slowing down a little and never having to stop to turn. So basically dolphin flying, slow down in the lift, speed up in the sink. And in order to do that, by the way, as Colin and I learned in a flight out of Parowan, Utah, is you don't, in strong lift like this, you don't want to be right up against Class A airspace, because then you're reverse dolphin flying. You're speeding up in the lift so that you don't bust 18,000 feet, and you're slowing down in the sink to try and lose some altitude. And so it's the exact opposite of what you want to do. So here I'm flying along at 16.7. I'm flying at my McCready speed, but John Seaborn is going to tell you that that's the wrong theory, Bob. Is that what you want to do is you want to go ahead and bump your McCready up so that you're going to actually be losing altitude in cruise as a general point. But when you hit that stronger piece of lift, go ahead and take a 6 or 7 knot climb, even though my McCready setting's at 3.2. And so I'm able to pretty much fly down this line without circling. But I probably could bump my cross-country speed by increasing my McCready speed or setting and flying at a higher speed, going ahead and taking a climb on occasion, rather than trying not to lose any altitude in cruise. So in other words, even though I'm on an energy line, fly your classic McCready. So XC skills that are required. Let's just talk briefly about that. As a newer pilot, what you want to basically be able to do is fly safely and carefully, as if on autopilot, without having to really think a lot about how to control your aircraft. You want to be totally comfortable with it. You've got to have good familiarity with your instruments and what they're telling you. You need to know basic navigation skills. And I think it's very important to fly with a map. Even though you might have a good moving map in the cockpit, flying with an actual paper map will be, I think, helpful. And in cruising, you want to be able to hold the desired course. And those of you that came directly to gliding without making a stop on powered aircraft, you might have missed a little bit of this. But obviously, if you're flying on a northerly course and you've got a 20-knot crosswind, you don't fly with a heading of north. You got to crab into the wind in order to be able to fly a north course. And for instance, if you're flying from Boulder to Pikes Peak and you've got a 20-knot west crosswind, so if you point the nose at Pikes Peak, you're going to fly a circular course, or at least a curved course to getting to Pikes Peak. You're not going to be flying your direct course. So practice, flying the course you want to fly and your speed to fly with classic McCready theory, but a little slower probably. And you obviously need to recognize the right route to fly based on the weather. And this comes in also with your flight planning, whether you're doing a task, you're working on a badge, or you're just maximizing your OLC. So planning and flying your flight. Well, obviously, check the weather. You want to fly the best weather you can. Choose your flight area. For instance, you typically out of Boulder, out of Kelly Air Park, the best flying is over the high ground. Kelly is a little different than Boulder in the fact that you start out up on, basically the Palmer Divide, so you're already over high ground. And so you're able to fly much more prominently to the east than we are out of Boulder. The other reason we have out of Boulder that it's not so good is, first of all, we're in a river valley, so the conditions aren't as good. And second of all, we've got a big hunk of Class B airspace directly east of us. So if you're going to fly a declared flight, if you're going to fly a contest task, or if you're flying OLC, you're going to fly a different flight. 3 turn points are an FAI triangle, and the choice of turn points is important here. I missed out on a 750-kilometer declared flight out of Parowan, Utah, because my last turn point was at, now I can't say the name of the ski area just west of there. I want to say Bryce Canyon, that's not it. Brian Head. I picked Brian Head as my last turn point. Well, coming home, I can't get high enough to make my turn point because I picked it on top of a mountain. And so I was deprived of completing a task because I chose the wrong turn point. So your choice of turn points is important. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that influence our cross-country flying out of Boulder too, or out of Kelly, or any place in the West really. And that is TFRs are a huge issue in the summer because we're going to have wildfires. And as much as we hope they're not going to start, they always do. And the drier it is, the more of a problem. And so it's really important for you to know where those TFRs are. It used to be difficult to load TFRs into your flight computer. It's not hard anymore. And so what you want to do is you want to use this website here, Soaring Data. And this is a website run by a glider pilot from Utah named Lynn Alley. And if you use his data, you might consider sending him a few bucks because he puts a lot of effort into this to make this go. And so what you do is you click on the TFR section, you tell them where you're flying and to what section of airspace you want to figure it out for, and it downloads a file you can put right into your flight computer to know where it is. Now, if your flight computer doesn't have that capability, print a copy, because there's nothing worse than trying to fly cross country when there is a TFR and you don't really know where it is and you're afraid to bust it. So it's really important to know where the TFRs are. The next point in Colorado, of course, is related to wildfires as well, and that's where's the smoke. One of my new favorite websites, it's not that new, but within the last year or two, is windy.com. If you haven't used that before, I encourage you to check out this website. It's great. And not just for figuring out for wildfire smoke, but if you go to windy.com, you go to more layers, and you go to particulate matter greater than 2.5 microns, it'll give you a map that'll depict where the particulate matter is or wildfire smoke. So it's really important also to know where that wildfire smoke is, because as we found out a number of occasions this last summer, the smoke can get so bad as your IFR. You have gone below VFR minimums in terms of visibility, and it's really important to know where that smoke is. So I encourage you to be prepared to know where the wildfire smoke is. The other thing that we need to know, and this came from a presentation by Dave Leonard, and those of you from Kelly and Black Forest, of course, know Dave. Dave's one of the best cross-country pilots on the planet, and he made a weather presentation where he actually used some material that was originally developed by Richard Kellerman. And what this does, I'm going to go through this quickly, but this relates to how a blip map is created from a skew T. And I don't mean to cover ground again that Bob Ferris has already covered in his great weather presentation. But what you basically can see here on this skew T, and it's obviously for some place near sea level rather than in Boulder, but what you can see as you look at this, the thermal updraft velocity is the difference between the temperature and the lifted parcel of air. You add in the top of the boundary layer, how high can you climb? You add in what the cumulus potential is and where cloud base is going to be. You look at the boundary layer depth. You look at the critical updraft height. You look at the thermal variability. In other words, some thermals may go higher than others. And so everything that you see on a blip map or SkySight or whatever type of soaring forecast you use, it's all derived from data that's mapped out thermodynamically on the skew T chart. And then important that we're going to talk about in a minute is CAPE, because weather dictates soaring in Colorado. It really does. And of course it does anywhere. But in Colorado, thunder be happening. And so what we want to look at is when good clouds go bad. And so what we see here is a day when we've got quite a bit of moisture, good thermal day. But what do we have here? The temperature line is not capped with any inversion. And so what's going to happen here is the clouds go thermonuclear and you're going to get thunderstorms with big vertical buildups. And in Colorado, these things go to 40,000 feet plus. And so what's going to happen as well on a day like this is the latent heat of evaporation. So when water evaporates, it absorbs energy. There's an absorption of energy. When that water condenses back out, that energy is released, which helps fuel this vertical development of this cloud. And so that's very important to understand the day you're going to have thunderstorms. That's not to say don't fly on a day like that, but respect those thunderstorms. Now, how else can good clouds go bad? Well, we've got a similar day, good soaring, got a lot of moisture, but now you've got a cap or an inversion with altitude that's going to stop the rising air. So when you have a lot of moisture like that, what's going to happen is you're going to get overcast development or spread. And in a situation like that, that's one of the days when you don't see vertical development in the clouds, but they tend to fill in and you're going to have virga. And so here you're going to end up with ground shading and you're going to be in a situation where you've got to worry about the day shutting down. So it's really important to understand these two phenomena that's going to dictate a lot of our weather flying in Colorado and in the West in general. So let's talk a little bit about XC flying out of Boulder. Well, the high ground is going to focus the lift and the clouds are going to build first there. Convergence is often the key. And so that's going to be the first clouds. Like it's not uncommon. You're standing at the field in Boulder, probably at Kelly or Owl Canyon as well. You're standing there on the field and it's 9 in the morning and you look west and there's already some clouds forming. Well, those are typically going to be forming in the convergence line. And again, those clouds are generated as those two air masses meet. You're going to always end up flying on blue days on occasion. And blue days, I don't remember who told me this, but blue days are great because it takes all the science of reading clouds out of the issue. You don't need to be able to read clouds. So you just fly until you hit the ground, or you fly until you run into a thermal. But you can also improve your odds on blue days by, again, flying terrain that's going to focus lift, high ground, ridges, continental divide, and pay attention on days when there's good clouds, because typically where those good clouds are on a cloud day, there'll be a thermal in those same locations on blue days. So you can learn a lot about how to fly blue days by paying attention to where the clouds are. And if you're flying out on the plains, again, a lot of times on days when the top of lift is relatively low, flying out in the plains is much more comfortable. If you got a 14,000 foot cloud base and you're over the plains, you're golden. If you got a 14,000 foot cloud base in the mountains, well, you're not even going to clear some areas of the continental divide. One other point that's really important, I think, as well, is flying from point A to point B is rarely a straight line. The flight I referenced earlier that Clements and I made, the mission was to go down and hit 5 14,000 foot peaks for Clements to be able to claim for the 14er challenge, which again was organized by Colin Berry, where you fly over the summits of all the 14ers in the state. And so that's our mission. But how did we get there? Well, if you watch Clements' video, you'll see we did anything but a direct line to fly to that point. But we flew in good lift the whole way because we were flying where the good lift was, where the good clouds were. Again, turn points are critical. And here's something that Colin Berry told me very early on that's very important. And that is, if you insist on landing at an airport, you will. And I say, don't shade your route to airports. So if you're flying over good soaring area and you start getting a little low, and so you go, well, I'm going to edge out toward Longmont Airport just in case I need to land at Longmont Airport. Well, if you do that, you're going to land at Longmont Airport because it's probably not good soaring over the plains, and you're leaving the area where you can soar. And so don't shade your route. If you start getting worried and getting low, that's not to say don't go to a safe place to land. When you have to, do that. But it doesn't have to be an airport, and you have to be willing to land out. So again, weather on course. Be flexible, be willing to deviate, be willing to go ahead and change your course if you need to. Get high and stay high, but you must work an altitude band. In other words, longer glides between your climbs will help you out in the end. But again, you can be selective when you're high, but as you start to get low, grab it. And again, if the weather's bad at home, don't go there right now. If you can soar where you are, don't go home when the thunderstorm's moving over the airport. And what's really important is to have a plan and fly it. Don't wander around, and don't ever give up. But obviously, at a certain point in time, you say, I'm landing. I have no choice. I'm low. I picked a field. I'm going to land. And so now it's time to give up, focus on your landing, but don't give up until you have to. So I'm going to go quickly through this, but like one of the flights early on that I thought would be cool to get a silver badge is you go from Boulder up to Owl Canyon up here. And what you're going to see is, boy, I can hop to Longmont Airport. There's a private field here. There's lots of landing areas out, farm fields and so on. The Fort Collins Loveland Airport, I forget what that's called now, but it changed its name, and it's got a control tower. And then you've got Chrisman Field at Fort Collins, and then you're at Owl Canyon. What's wrong with that flight path, though, is that's not where the soaring's going to be good. So number 2 in this RASP print of convergence lines, or boundary layer max up down, is what this is. Boulder's number 2, Owl Canyon here's number 3. If you fly that course, you're not flying where it's good. Pick the turn points that are going to be out where the weather's good. This again comes from Dave Leonard, a presentation that he made. I've got some of your pictures in the way, so I can't read when it was. I think it was 2011. But he talks about prioritizing the decisions you need to make in different time schedules. So rapid, you need to make thermal centering adjustments. You avoid hitting the mountain, you avoid hitting your buddy. So those have to be made in rapid succession. Say he's got it a 3-second decision, 30-second decisions. What's your cruise speed? Do I stop or go on? Do I leave a thermal or not leave a thermal? You can think about that for a bit, and that's your priority there. Going on to the next one, 3 minutes decision is how are you going to leave the thermal? Where are you going to head? Are there markers ahead? Are the clouds better going left or right of course? You can make that decision over a time period of like 3 minutes. The 30-minute decisions, that's how you prioritize this decision making. So you're going to be looking at where are the clouds better or worse? Are there good streets? How big's the thunderstorm getting? Where's my next turn point? How late can I stay out? Do I have enough to make final glide home? And so again, I think this has helped me a lot in my flying, is to think about when I need to be making a basic decision. And so he's got this at 3 seconds, 3 minutes, et cetera, or 30 seconds, 3 minutes, and 30-minute decision time. I know we're running a little over, so bear with me a little bit. I'll try and go quickly. I show you a flight I made here in my Ventus out of Nephi, Utah. And it's one of the best flights of my career. And I don't show you this to tell you what a fine pilot I am. I show you this because I didn't have as good a flight as I should have had. And so how can I learn from this? Well, do I have a plan? Do I go from point A to point B? The original mission was to fly a task going down south out of Nephi to the Parowan area, and we ran out of clouds. So all of a sudden, my plan got changed. And so I didn't make another plan. So I flew, it was a great day. I flew out here past Green River, Utah. I wandered up here around the Uinta Mountains. I went over back to Nephi. I made some stupid little leg here. And then I wandered over here and flew down the Colorado Plateau, back up north, and back home to Nephi. Well, what did I do right? Well, I was working a good altitude band, basically 12.5 to 17.8. That was pretty good. Can I count to 6? You only get 6 legs in the OLC. Well, I flew 7 or 8 if you consider this little stupid excursion I made here. Did I fly energy lines? Well, I did pretty well there. And high ground, you can see how I focused the flight over high ground. Did I have a plan? Like, for instance, I didn't get credit for any of this distance like this, only from point A to point B. And so, what all do I learn from that? Well, let's look real briefly here at CU and see what we can learn. Well, I had 23% thermaling for the flight. I had an overall average of 4.7 knot climb rate. But look here, I turned left pretty well. I climbed at 5.1 knots when I'm turning left, only 4.4 when I'm turning right. So can I not climb when I'm turning right? It kind of looks that way. So what else can we learn? Well, in terms of netto or flying in rising air, I was in rising air during cruise 64% of the time, and I had a mean L over D for the whole flight of 72 on a glider that gets 50 to 1 maybe at best glide speed. So what you're able to see here as you analyze your flight, you can see where I did okay and where I really could have done a lot better. So what difference did it make? Well, my OLC scoring, I got 934 kilometers at 128 kilometers an hour. I did close my triangle, which is important. And I'm sure that'll be talked about when we talk about OLC flying, I think next week with Bob Ferris. But I flew a total distance. I only got credit for 933 kilometers. I flew almost 1,200 kilometers at almost 150 kilometers an hour. And so I only got credit for 79% of the flight. So, and I also flew one too many legs, or maybe two too many legs. So I really didn't do as well. I had a good flight, but it could have been a great flight. So just as another thing in terms of analyzing your flight, like what do you do well? This is a blow up from CU of a thermal I climb in. And so what you can see is I enter the thermal, I promptly turn the wrong direction. So I turned right, I should have turned left, but I probably didn't know any better. One of the things you can learn here is, again, the 270-degree thermal entry. You turn the wrong way, so you keep turning rather than trying to reverse your circle. Keep turning, roll out at 270 degrees, fly into the thermal, and start climbing. And again, as you look at these circles, are they nice and round? No, not so nice and round. Up here, I'm circling in sync, and so that's not too bright. And so what you can do here is you can really get down to the nuts and bolts of your flying and figure out what you do right and wrong. So rules of thumb, let's go through these quickly. Climb is king. That is a direct quote from John Seaborn. And I also just watched a video by G. Dale. And for those of you that have seen his books, The Soaring Engine, I highly recommend them. There's 3 volumes out now, and the 4th one will be out shortly. But nothing makes you a better pilot and a better cross-country pilot than climbing better. So fly very precisely, center quickly, watch out for the system lag in your glider variometer system. Make sure you're flying steep enough bank angles. And what's really important here, again, I learned this from John Seaborn as well as Richard Hall, is make sure you fly attitude. Don't chase the needle, your airspeed needle. Put your nose at a position on the horizon and keep it there. And your airspeed's going to vary because there's turbulence, there's gusts. Your airspeed will vary somewhat, but as long as you keep your nose at that attitude position, you're going to basically be holding the right airspeed, even though it may momentarily vary. Choose good thermals. Carl Striedek's rule of thumb that I learned from him. If you don't center in 2 turns, leave. Obviously, there's an exception to that. If you need a climb, make sure you center, take as many as you need to center. Don't stop unless you can gain 1,000 feet. And newer pilots tend to do this, is that they tend to fly around at the top of lift, and they'll take any climb they can find to stay, between 17,000 and 17,999. There is the 10 knot exception, and there is the idea that you might have to change gears. So you're flying along, you're looking ahead, and there's a big blue hole. You don't need 1,000 feet to climb, but you're going to go ahead and tank up before you cross that blue hole. McCready setting tells you when to stop and when to leave, but also consider your centering time. So in other words, you may have your thermal strength dropping off as you climb, but the fact that you've spent time in order to get centered, you might want to stay a little longer. always be aware of wind direction, speed, sun position, and use the appearance of the cloud and what your experience is about where under the cloud the best lift is. A 50% rule. If you're between the clouds and the terrain, if you're above 50% an altitude, fly the clouds. If you're below, pay attention to the terrain, but never just ignore the clouds. And this is something important too. When you're climbing below the top of nearby terrain, in other words, you're close to the rocks, avoid circling, carry some extra speed. Gavin Wills from New Zealand, in the first contest I flew in, always said, carry an extra 5 knots for your mum. So anyway, that's Gavin's rule. Carry some extra speed and don't circle back at the terrain, especially on strong days, because it'll kill you. Look down course as you're circling. It's hard to see what your course is going to be when you're at cloud base. So be looking down course before you get there. Cruise from point A to point B isn't usually a straight line. Using speed to fly theory, I don't know why my internet connection's unstable, but using speed to fly theory is good, but maybe err a little bit on the slow side because it doesn't hurt you much. When you're low, obviously slow down and be prepared to take any climb. And again, on Clement's blog that you'll find is you never fly McCready 0 because it gives you no margin. So read Clement's blog on that. He explains it much better and much more eloquently than I can. And again, don't chase the needle. It's always tempting to pull up into a thermal, and that can work well, especially if you're following another glider so you know where that thermal is. But a lot of times the thermals are small enough that if you pull up into that thermal, it's going to be late. And then when you push over, you're trying to accelerate and sink. So do pull-ups, I guess, conservatively. Energy lines are critically important. Look for convergence, cloud streets, terrain effects, fly the high ground, work an altitude band. And this is something that's really important that I think all experienced pilots do. And that's watch the cloud shadows to gauge wind drift and how far away that next cloud is. Because simply looking at the cloud, it's really hard to tell. But if you can look at where its shadow is, that'll help you out a lot. Always be aware of wind direction, speed, as well as sun position, and make course deviations to fly in better weather. A 30-degree course deviation costs you almost nothing. And so that's a pretty good course deviation, but I've done more than that. And again, if you can better the weather, better the conditions you're flying in, a course deviation helps. If you can ballast up on the good days, it really helps. Look ahead, look way ahead, and always anticipate those changing conditions. And both in thermaling and in cruise, don't ever fly through the same bad air twice. So a closing quote before I turn it over to some discussion is the Navy SEALs say that their quote is, when you're under pressure, you don't rise to the occasion, you sink to the level of your training. And I think the emphasis of training, it doesn't have to be flying with your flight instructor, although that's important too, but every flight, treat it as training. You're going to spot land like you're landing out. You're going to fly precisely in thermals. You're going to be prepared to bail out. So after you land, don't just get out of your sailplane and download your flight. Think about what you would do if you had to bail out. So reach for your canopy releases, don't pull them. Reach for those canopy releases. Reach for the belts. Feel for where your D-ring is, your ripcord. be prepared. Every flight is training for you. So anyway, thanks for your attention. And let me go ahead and get rid of this, and we'll see if we have some time for discussion. Oh, I'm sorry. There's the links at the end of this. I'm sure that this will be posted, but here's links to the Black Forest Soaring Society's weather page that's run by Dave Leonard, among other things, the soaring data, windy.com. Down below is johncochran.com, where he talks about soaring, and he has a number of excellent articles there, a link to windy.com and so on. But anyway, again, thanks for your attention, and let me get rid of my sharing of the screen.
Well, Bob, that was terrific.
Okay, sorry to have run over.
Oh, no, that's fine. Thanks so much. I think we had one question I saw that came through. So we'll get to that one first. And Jack wanted to know how you tell the difference between a cloud street and convergence.
Well, obviously, a convergence line is typically a cloud street. The difference would be there is when there's a couple of hints you can use. First of all, if you have instantaneous wind in your system and you can read instantaneous wind, you'll see a wind direction change. Sometimes your wind speed will go to 0. So that can be something very important. The next thing, of course, is the step and cloud base. And in Clement's photo that I showed, where there's a dramatic step in cloud base, that's a really powerful suggestion that it's a convergence line, not just a cloud street. The cloud street will typically be the same, some more developed than others. Some might be falling out, some might be building. But the clouds will look like clouds as opposed to having a step in cloud base and differing looking clouds on one side of the convergence versus the
other. Anybody else have something?
Anybody else?
I'm going to add something, if I may. Your quote after the Yogi Berra quotes. Something to, I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me, but something to the effect of, all this stuff. I'll relate that. I got a coaching session from Richard Hall that was just excellent and really made a big difference in my ability to get up and start going places. And that I did a flight with him, and I came back. And I thought about it, and I think I told a couple of people, Richard didn't tell me anything I didn't already know. He just told me I wasn't doing those things that I already knew I should be doing. And so I think, as soaring pilots, we go through our training and we get a lot of information and we go, oh, yeah, I know that. But that doesn't mean we're doing it. And so, it's important that we all really, not just know these things, but actually do these things, and we can recognize when we're not doing them. And I think that's something that coaching helps. If you can have a coach say, hey, you're not doing what you know you should be doing. And so keep that in mind, everybody.
Hi, Bob.
Yeah, you make an excellent point, Armin. Just let me make one quick point. I just wanted to say, Armin brought up an excellent point. You newer pilots out there, don't be afraid to approach more experienced pilots. That was instrumental in my development as a soaring pilot, is people befriended me, they shared their knowledge with me, they drugged me along on flights. Don't be afraid to get to know pilots that are more experienced than you. And really, you're going to learn a lot from just getting to know other pilots. So you make an excellent point there, Armin. Sorry if I interrupted somebody, but what was next?
No worries. Thanks, Bob. I really appreciate your presentation. It's outstanding. Two questions as a new pilot. I think the two things I'm intimidated by approaching this season are being 100 to 150 miles away from home and the sky blows up and being stuck in weather. And then two, flying in wind. So, you know, again, as a newer pilot, I would quantify that as anything over 20 knots. You know, it's one thing if you're up at 18,000 feet and it's over 20 knots, but it's a different thing if you're, you know, below 12. Do you have any stories or advice or thoughts on how to tackle those two mental hurdles and challenges?
Well, being a long ways from home is intimidating. There's no two ways about it. And especially if the day's deteriorating or the weather's changing. And so I don't have any real words of wisdom there other than be aware of what's happening. You know, circling while you're climbing is the perfect way to keep yourself aware of what's happening in every quadrant. So anyway, just really be always aware of what's happening. Wind, again, the higher the wind in a thermal soaring day, at least, the more, and this is a measure on a lot of your soaring forecasts, is the buoyancy shear ratio, which is basically how buoyant is the air versus how torn up is it going to be. It's a measure of whether the thermals are cohesive and held together or whether they're blown apart. And so again, as on strong wind days, on thermal days, again, you want to be aware of the terrain. You don't want to be on the lee side of high terrain, and especially low, but even high on the lee side of high terrain, you can get a harmonic that's setting up even though it's not a classic wave, it's going to be a harmonic that there's going to be sink on the lee side of that higher terrain when there's high wind. And again, coming home in high wind, you always have to be concerned of whether it's blowing down the runway or not. Obviously, landing in 30 knots right down the runway is a lot different than trying to land in 30 knots due cross. So again, pay attention to what AWOS is telling you. If the wind direction is changing due to storms or weather systems, you know, you might just want to hang out for a while and monitor AWOS and see if conditions are going to change. So again, just because you're trying to get home, you know, you don't want to be landing in 30 knots of crosswind. So again, flying in higher wind, you know, be respectful of it. That's all I can really say.
Yeah, I mean, I would also add that
Anyway.
Hey, Bob, I have a question for you, if I may. Can you hear me?
Okay.
You
yeah.
mentioned to fly of earlier of 87 now, or 87, you said. And was that you considering true airspeed or indicated airspeed when you say that?
Phil, you really broke up a lot. I'm not sure if anybody else caught that question, but if anybody else got the question, let me know what it was.
Can you hear me any better now? Yes.
That was pretty broken.
Was the speed to fly you mentioned, were you considering true airspeed or indicated airspeed?
I'm talking indicated airspeed. Obviously, true airspeed is something to be concerned with, especially flying at high altitudes, because flutter, controlled surface flutter, is based on true airspeed as opposed to indicated airspeed. And so you certainly want to be aware of that. But the airspeeds I've been talking about for speed to fly and so on are indicated.
Thank you.
And
Clemens,
Bob,
did you have a
No, I just wanted to comment on the I mean, the weather forecasts are pretty good these days, and um, flying 150 miles away when there's a thunderstorm day, it's probably not a great idea. And also flying 150 miles away in very strong winds is not a great idea. So, but the forecasts are pretty good. So if a cold front is coming in, you might where you might have winds of 30 knots on the ground. By the time you come back, don't go out and fly 150 miles away from the airport. I don't. And the same for thunderstorm days. I had one experience last year where I was coming back from South Park on a thunderstorm day. Bob Ferris was coming back on the same day, and Bob Ferris actually went through hail, and he told me what a hail was, so I was able to avoid the hail. But I had lightning flash right down the canopy in front of my eyes, and that was the most scary experience that I have had flying so far. So I'm very, very aware of thunderstorms, especially since that experience, and I will not go fly far away if there's a thunderstorm day.
And Bob, we got another question here that Colin asks. So can you tell us what makes for a great day, when looking at forecasts? What do you look for forecasts and know, boy, this is a great day, I'm going?
Well, first of all, I watch the TV weather. And, flying out of Boulder, if it's going to be a nice warm summer day and they're saying that it's going to be less than 20% chance of thunderstorms, it's probably going to be good soaring out of Boulder. But then as you get closer to the day you're going to fly, you want to be looking at, again, the thunderstorm potential, which is going to be in CAPE. And I didn't define that. For those of you that don't know what that means, it's convective available potential energy. And so it's basically how much energy is going to be available in the atmosphere to build those thunder boomers. And you want to look at days where there's relatively low percentage of thunderstorms. I want higher cloud bases. I go flying regardless, but you want to have cloud base usually well above 14,000 feet. And so you can see that in your weather predictions that you're going to want to pay attention to. And again, one of the things that I have heard other pilots talk about is when there is a low pressure trough to the east side of the state of Colorado, and you have those kinds of weather conditions, that can be your big day. And again, I just want to see high cloud base, of course, high thermal strength. You're going to want to be able to have good thermal height variability. In other words, you want all the thermals going right up to cloud base so that you can climb to cloud base, or at least as close to Class B airspace Class A airspace as you're going to want to go. And just as a word of warning, something I neglected to mention about Class A airspace is I got back from a cross-country flight this last year, and I had a note on my trailer to call Denver Center, which is a little disconcerting. Anyway, so I called Denver Air Traffic Control Center, and they knew who I was because I'm flying with a Mode S transponder and ADS-B out, and so they know exactly who I am. But they could identify me, but there were a number of other gliders flying that day with just Mode C transponders. And so they couldn't identify who those pilots were. And what they were telling me is a number of those pilots were violating Class A airspace. And they weren't happy about it at all, because our north-south flying routes, most of what our flying was that day, we were down in the arrival routes that are coming in over Kenosha Pass and that area down there. And so a bunch of Kelly guys were flying there, and a bunch of the Boulder guys were flying there. And Denver Center was seeing a number of these people violating Class A airspace. And what's important to note is you can violate Class A airspace even though your altimeter and your flight computer doesn't tell you you're violating that airspace, because local pressure changes are going to change the pressure altitude you're actually flying at. And so one of the things as you're flying cross country you want to do is to dial in the AWOS for airports near where you are and adjust your altimeter setting so that you don't bust Class A airspace. Another thing you can do is what they do in contests, and that is just don't climb above 17.5. And you can be pretty sure you're never going to bust Class A airspace. So be very careful about that. But anyway, I digressed.
Bob, we got a couple questions here from Jeff Clayton. He's not new to flying, but he is new to gliders, and he's going to be doing great. He was one of my students. And do you challenge yourself, better prepare for contest flying by tasks over the plains? And what would be the difference in strategy for flying over the plains versus the mountains?
Well, there's really no difference other than flying over the plains. You don't tend to get the streeting like you do over the mountains, where you get terrain effects that focus the clouds. You will get streeting, but typically the streeting over the plains is going to be along wind lines, whereas the streeting over the mountains are a lot of times more focused by terrain rather than just wind lines. And so probably the biggest thing about flying over the plains is you don't have as many terrain clues as to where to look for the next thermal, like you do in the mountains. So you're flying ahead and you see a ridge ahead of you, and it's in the sun. It's got some wind, a little wind shadow, meaning the wind isn't blowing heavily on it. You know that there's rocks on there. You know that baby's going to heat up and probably going to kick off a thermal. Flying out over the plains, again, is a little different ballgame. And if you have clouds, of course, you can fly the clouds. But on a blue day out on the plains, it's a little dicey because you're basically, as I had mentioned earlier, you're flying until you hit the ground or hit a thermal. And so, again, flying over the plains is a little different ballgame. But again, the terrain, and so a lot of times you've got a lot of air underneath you, and so you can reach out and glide a long ways between between thermal sources. I don't know if that helped answer that question or not, but
yeah. And another question that he had that I think is very relevant, and that is, how do you determine the best range of altitude to fly? In other words, how do you know what the lift band is? And we talk about the best band to be in.
Yeah, that's a very important thing. Usually the top of the band is easily defined because it's at cloud base or it's at Class A airspace. And so the top of the band is easily defined. The lower band is the one that's a little more dicey. And commonly people will refer to the altitude band that you want to be flying as the power band. And I think as you experience this, a lot of times you can kind of define that in your initial climb out. Because, you know, let's say you tow over to Gold Hill west of Boulder and you release at 9,000 feet. Well, climbing out from 9,000 feet, it's a struggle. The thermals are tight, they're small, they're not very strong, they're turbulent usually, and they're hard to work. And then as you climb higher and higher, those thermals become better, more uniform. They're more easy to work, and that's not necessarily a line of demarcation that you're going to find. But what you're going to find is that you're going to see that that area where the thermals become easier to work and stronger, and so on. That's going to be your lower end. And again, I tend to, flying out of Boulder, I tend to use 3,000 feet to be what I'm going to fly. So if I'm able to climb to 17.5, when I'm down to 14.5, I'm starting to be seriously looking for a climb. That's not to say that I don't, descend down to 12.5 sometimes before I find a climb, but a lot of times it's harder to dig out from that lower altitude. And so it's my rule of thumb, flying, again, flatlands, back east, whatever, it's going to be very different. But flying over the Rockies, I usually use 3,000 feet plus or minus as a rule of thumb that I use.
Great explanation. Anybody else have questions? Feel free to either do it in the chat or just verbally. Well then, if nobody else has anything, we'll start to wrap it up here. Bob, thanks so much. This was another just great presentation. And I want, I think probably most of the pilots here on this presentation are more advanced pilots, and I want you all to start thinking about the capstone session that we're going to have at the end of this series, and I really want that one to be for the aspiring pilots. And so that one's going to be all about the aspiring pilots, and I want to have them featured on that one. But I really need to have those of you that are accomplished pilots like Bob and some of the others here to really be on to help out and make that sort of a group coaching session. So with that, thank you everybody for joining. We'll see you next week. And Bob's Farrah, we'll have a different Bob next week. And he's going to talk about OLC and speed weekends. And so we want to make sure we get a lot of points. 2 years ago, we were #1, and unfortunately, we dropped to #2 this year in OLC. So we want to get first place back, and we got a bunch of great aspiring pilots who are going to help push that along. And so thanks, everybody, and we'll see you all next week.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, folks.
Thanks, Bob.